Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see so many people here, and it's lovely to have the chance for the chatting in between times and the reception that is to come. But before the reception, we're going to have the third of our three panels, and this time we're going to talk about net zero ambitions, transitions, and climate change. And it's very nice for me to be joined by two friends and colleagues from the University of Cambridge. Cristina Peñasco, who's in Polis and is the director of the Master in Public Policy, the program at Polis, and is an economist who works on innovation policy and for technologies for decarbonisation, net zero transitions. And Matthew Agarwala, who is one of the leads at the Bennett Institute working on the Wealth Economy Project, also an economist, also interested in how we measure, think about, finance transitions to net zero, but also more broadly, environmental questions. So I propose that we run this quite informally and have as much time for discussion as possible. So I'm going to just ask Cristina to just say a little bit about her current research, what she's done, and as a basis then for then a conversation about net zero transition questions. I'll turn to Matthew, ask him the same question, and then we can open it up to discussion. Cristina.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much, CSaP, for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to share the floor with all you. Well, I guess this is a very nice audience to start speaking about what I've been doing, because actually the last years of my academic careers, I've been devoting my time to create a decarbonization policy evaluation tool. And this decarbonization policy evaluation tool was the result of conversations with people like you in different aspects of the project I was working in with Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon as well in the University of Cambridge and Professor Elena Berdolini in the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change. So they developed this idea with conversations with policymakers and academics and so on, that there were a lot of scattered evidence about the effects of different decarbonization policies on the environment, on innovation, sometimes on competition, on competitiveness, sometimes in distributional impacts. But there was not a place in which we could compare, centralize, and share all this information in a democratic way. So we created this decarbonization policy evaluation tool with the intention of creating this platform, open access, to inform people taking the decision, to inform academics, to inform as well the general public about all these impacts just in one place. And when I say impacts, I'm not talking only about the environmental effectiveness of the policies, which of course, this is something that we all care about, but it's also about the technological development, technological effectiveness. How can we reduce the cost of these technologies? How can we promote the innovation in new technologies? How can we make these technologies competitive? How can we inform the people about the use of these technologies, of these measures, and what are the impacts and implications in terms of the distribution for the different income levels, citizens in different income levels? Because if we don't involve the citizen in this, if we don't get the support, the political acceptability of any measure we put in place is not going to happen, and we need to get the people on board. So that was what we were trying to do during the last years. The decarbonization policy evaluation tool is open, it's running right now, and what we actually see is that most of these policies, we analyze specifically 10 different policies. The tool is prepared for being populating with many more, but so far we use the ones more widely spread around the world. So we have feed-in tariffs, travel green certificates, emission trading systems, green public procurement. I feel is a very important topic to touch on these days as well. R&D, building codes, up to 10 different policies. We put all that, and we see that from an environmental perspective, these policies have actually a positive impact most of the time in their goals. So we have reduced emissions, we have improved the technologies, people have adopted or companies have adopted more these technologies, we have reduced this cost. But when we move towards the spectrum of more technical part of the policy to the people, the effects, how this affects SMEs, how this affects households, the picture is different. So I think in the context we are right now, 2 weeks up to COP, we need to reconcile and understand better which are or how can we reconcile these short-term negative impacts that we see in these policies with the long-term positive impacts that we need to get in terms of the environment. And it's all about design. I want to reinforce the idea that it's not only about the policies, about how we design these policies. Depending on how we design, we can transform these short-term negative impacts into co-benefits. There is evidence about this. For feed-in tariffs with stable and predictable systems, probably adjusted to technologies individually, all those things reduces the negative impacts that we can see for certain type of factors in the society. If we implement carbon taxes, everybody talks about carbon taxes, it's not the only instrument, but we need to create the recycling mechanisms that allows those in low income households to not be worse off with these policies, or when we put in place these policies. When we talk about R&D, someone mentioned in the Leveling Up session the importance of R&D for SMEs and so on. There is evidence that there is a crowding need effect of public money. Of course, the public sector cannot do all by themselves, by itself. We need to crowd in the private sector, and probably that's when Matthew will talk about later about finance and green finance and the role of green finance. That's very important, and the role of green public procurement. How we can actually, from local communities, for example, promote the use of this instrument because they know better what their people needs. So that is what I've been doing during the last years, and I'm really looking forward to questions if
Great.
You feel.
Great. I'm just going to ask one quick question. I mean, we really are supposed to go on to Matthew, but if anybody wants to dive in with very specific questions to Cristina, then we'll open it up. You said this is a global, a global survey of these 10 policy instruments. How are you managing to deal with the fact, as we discussed in the Leveling Up panel, that obviously the different national contexts are going to differ very much, and so how do you manage to sort of say anything robustly about the global picture?
We provide information about all the context, but it's true that the evidence is very skewed. So we have a lot of information about the global north, much less about the global south. Middle East countries, China is starting to grow in terms of evidence. So what we didn't try to do is analyze the specific context itself. So we have the information about it. We offer the reader a summary of how this has worked in this specific context, but we haven't unified in terms of countries because the institutional context within them makes it impossible to draw conclusions globally. So we know what's happening in general, but if we look at the specificities of the countries and the institutional context, because they are very different, we cannot actually draw general conclusions on that.
So it's largely a reviewing evaluations that are done on their country-specific interventions.
On the country, there are also as well some at the regional level. We can find some information about certain regions. About, for example, in the US, a lot of the research in the US, because of the global context of the governance of the country, is much more focused at the state level than in the country level. So we try to provide the reader all this information and then a summary of how good or bad the different policies have been during the last year. Basically because in order to inform the ones that we are going to need, so we have all the targets, but we need the policies to reach those targets. If we want to inform better policies, we need to understand what has worked better or worse in the last years. This is what we
Okay, final question before you, and this the big one, is that given what you now know about the effectiveness of these various policy interventions, and given, obviously we're all thinking about the COP meeting in Glasgow, I mean, are we going to manage it? You know, do you think that that we can meet the challenge? Yes or no?
That's the question.
I'm so glad this went to you.
I'm optimistic, but I don't think the COP itself as a negotiation process is the one that is going to give us the answer. There is this country narrative, local narrative, regional things that we have to deal with. And the top-down agenda is not always the optimal one. In this case, I think the bottom-up has a lot to say. So yes, the COP is a fantastic event, a fantastic negotiation. It's needed, it's necessary, but I could say it's not sufficient. And we will see a lot of action within the countries and the parties itself from a more bottom-up approach, I think.
Great, thanks. So, Matthew.
Right, so I'm delighted to be here and to see so many people I've met before in some of our face-to-face, one-to-one meetings, and others who I've tried to connect with through the ether of social media and news reports, but never quite made it. So I'm glad that I've got a captive audience now. But I'm also aware that I'm the last thing between you and wine, so I don't want to overrun my time. There's a load of work that we're doing at the Bennett that I think is relevant to this agenda. We have the Wealth Economy Project. We have some work that we're doing on the variation in well-being across the UK and how we analyze that at different scales. So we're talking about the well-being of individuals, the well-being of the United Kingdom, or at local authorities or various different spatial scales in between. The results as to what matters to drive that well-being changes. And of course we have a major project on how we address the productivity puzzle, the productivity problem that we've faced in the UK, where productivity growth has essentially flatlined since around the time of the financial crisis. And the deviation between what had been sort of the historical trend in productivity growth and where we've been since the 2008 financial crisis amounts to about a 20%, 22% shortfall in output per worker in the UK, which is a pretty substantial loss. So that's one of the projects that we're working on. The Wealth Economy Project, I'll explain. Some of you may now be rolling eyes because you've seen this, sort of Cristina and Rob, so many times. But the way I like to think about the economy is just imagine you're running a bakery. It's very simple. The size of the pie you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients you have in your pantry. Run out of ingredients, tomorrow's pie is smaller. It works out, the economy is exactly the same, no more complicated than that, except the core ingredients of economic prosperity are capital assets, they're wealth. It's things like natural capital, the quality and health and quantity of our ecosystems, the stability of our climate system, and the cleanliness of our air. It's our human capital, which economists have typically defined in terms of the returns, the market returns to education. How much more do we earn if we get a degree? But the way we like to think about it is that it crucially includes the health of the population, because it's the human health that determines the labor productivity as much as it is the education. So it's the natural and the human capital. It's also the social capital, which of the mix of the ingredients is the hardest to measure. But this refers to the trust that we have in each other, in businesses, in governments, in the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems. And we have seen how quickly we went from there's no such thing as society to let's all pull together to get through COVID, right? We saw how quickly people signed up to participate in the COVID mutual aid groups. But we also saw a huge variation in the establishment of those mutual aid groups across local authorities. So that if you scaled every local authority to have an equivalent population, you'd have some where you have the equivalent of 57 mutual aid groups formed, and in others, the equivalent of just one. That's a huge variation in the ability of communities to work together. And it speaks to the inequalities and to our ability to overcome not just health issues, but also environmental ones as well. And crucially, it's physical infrastructure. So that's the fourth key ingredient. Are we going to be investing now in trying to prop up the dying assets of the 19th and 20th century? Or are we going to use stimulus to invest in a low-carbon, clean, green, lean future economy? Those are the choices we've got. A lot of that will be old stuff to you. If I were to sit here and tell you, well, we need to join up policies so that the infrastructure bill and the planning bill and our climate strategy are all joined up and moving in the same direction, you'd roll your eyes because you've heard that. You've been saying that probably for years. What we're offering through the Wealth Economy Project is some core economic analysis on how these things can actually be done, on where the employment sits and how it might change as a result of investing in social infrastructure. We are looking at what the returns might be in one sector, so on education, if you are investing in the complementary assets, like the housing and the transport infrastructure around it. And that's when you can start to see, I think, the advantage of this way of thinking, which is linking up and making the most of the interactions between the assets. So that's the sort of the Wealth Economy Project in a nutshell.
And then the question is that given that analysis, what's your, what can that kind of analysis do to help with this question of transition to I don't know what we call it, net zero. Let's call it net zero.
Sure. So one of the outcomes of the Wealth Economy Project is something like a public sector balance sheet. It's crazy that we require balance sheets and financial reporting of a company that produces toilet paper that are more rigorous than we require of the entire government of the UK. But that's actually what happens. We don't have a complete set of accounts that cover the assets at the disposal of the United Kingdom. That's insane. Right? And so one of the things we're working on is developing that kind of public sector balance sheet. And once we have that, we can start integrating the balance sheet with the income flows. So start thinking about how changes in the physical assets, say carbon assets, fossil fuels become less valuable because we're decarbonizing and they're being phased out. How does that affect the fiscal triangle that the Treasury works in of tax, borrow, and spend? Well, their tax revenues are affected as a result. Right? And if that's going to happen, how are we going to make up for the shortfall in revenue in the future? Where are the other funds going to come from? So we can start doing intertemporal balance sheets to start thinking about how the Treasury can plan for decarbonization throughout the transition. We can also start doing fairly straightforward things like forecasting the fiscal sustainability. How much is our debt going to cost us in a 2-degree world versus a 3-degree world versus a 5-degree world? Climate change is going to affect the cost of sovereign debt. We've created an analysis that actually demonstrates this, and we created the world's first carbon-smart sovereign credit rating. And what we show is that without pretty substantial upfront investments in decarbonization, 63 countries, including the UK, can expect a sovereign downgrade of at least a notch within the next decade. Now, that's important, because when your sovereign rating gets downgraded, your cost of borrowing goes up. Not just your public cost of borrowing goes up, but it spills over to banks, financial institutions, and corporations. So their cost of borrowing goes up. If we're concerned about competitiveness throughout the transition, one thing we have to factor in is how much competitiveness we lose as a result of higher borrowing costs coming from failing to act on climate change. So there's issues on both sides of that balance sheet, and we can start to look at how the Treasury might respond, how public finances might respond, and I think that's an exciting thing to be able to do.
And in terms of the sort of timescales involved, timescales that we're thinking about almost sort of geologically in terms of timescale, not geologically necessarily. Well, it depends who you talk to. Some of the, but certainly, multiple decades, centuries, the kinds of commitments that governments need to make now, do you feel that the kinds of analysis that you're doing can help with that longer term planning and action?
Well, I think anybody who tells you what the world's going to look like in 2100, well, I suppose is either an economist or a madman. That's not the actual phrase, but I think it's apt. I don't like making forecasts to 2100, but the way the academic publishing world goes, if I don't get published, so we add it in. But what's going to happen over the next 10 years or 20 years? That, obviously highly uncertain, but a lot less so than over the next 80 years. The technologies that exist now are more like the technologies that will exist in 10 and 15 years than they are in 80 years. And so I think we can be more reasonable in our forecasts there. We don't actually predict changes in sovereign credit ratings. What we do is a scenario analysis based on the IPCC climate scenarios. And what we show is that, yeah, inside the decade, this country has a sovereign downgrade. And that matters. We buy gilts. The standard is a 10-year gilt. The 10-year treasury bond, this is a pretty standard. That's inside the rating horizon for S&P. So I think that matters. It speaks to our ability to roll over debt. And if we don't decarbonize now, our ability to do so is going to fall.
Great. Well, thank you both for sort of setting out your stall in terms of the kind of research you're doing and the kind of how that connects to this huge public policy challenge that lots of people in this room are actually working on. So I really want this to be the next sort of, what have we got, half an hour or so, to be a conversation. So I'm interested to hear from you, how you find in the context of policy you're working on, you're grappling with these, absolutely massive kind of set of questions, and the extent to which the kind of work that, Cristina, Matthew, and others are doing kind of relates that. Are you drawing on external analysis and expertise as you do that? Who wants to start off with a question either directly to Cristina or Matthew, or a comment on the... So we've got two people first. I think I might take a question at a time. Let's see how they go. So first, to Tara. And then again, if you can just briefly introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you. Fascinating research, and precisely the kind of research we need. I'm Tara Alice from McKinsey. I had one question to each of you, just to go one layer down in terms of some of the amazing stuff that you're doing. So for Cristina, I was really interested in when you look at evaluations and you find some lessons learned, if you have come across any sort of patterns in terms of what policymakers initially got wrong in their appraisals. Because of course they put those policies in on the basis of some cost-benefit analysis or other assessments. And then you've looked at them ex post. And is there like a systematic thing that we do as, in early on in policymaking that we should take on board and say, hey, actually, we've got it slightly wrong and we can learn from that in terms of future policy as well. And then for Matthew, it would be really fascinating if you said a little bit more about, was it 65 countries that might be on that list of sovereign downgrades, and like what not so much who they are, but what drives it, and whether some of the big countries we do need to be changing their energy use and their land use and everything else in order to actually stabilize the climate, whether they're on that list and might listen to your analysis.
Thank you very much, Tara, for the question, because this actually comes to the heart of what I am starting to do now with a project that has been actually received the help of BASE. So initially in this tool that I mentioned, we take into consideration different methodologies, ex-ante appraisals, ex-post evaluations, and how the policies have worked in the ground. And we realized that there are certain differences when we analyze the impact. So some of them tend to be more optimistic or more pessimistic in certain aspects, while the others are not. We are trying to disentangle this specific thing right now in this new project, and how we can inform better models. Because what we have seen is that traditional appraisals using cost-benefit analysis, but also techno-economic models, energy, environment, and technology models, have not modeled innovation in the right way. And in many cases, they only take into consideration a small range of policies that does not represent the whole fund of options that we have. When we analyze the policies in the ground, what we've seen is that innovation has happened in a higher scale than the one has been predicted by these models. Most of the times, yeah, because the technological change has been just put as a parameter. We haven't taken into consideration endogenous technological change and all that. So we are analyzing now what these policies or how these policies have worked in terms of innovation. There is a very interesting new paper as well of my former PI, Professor Laura Diaz-Anador in PNAS, analyzing exactly this, comparing how experts have been short in explaining the reduction in cost, how models have been short in explaining the reduction in costs, and how can we inform with policies in the ground and the results this into the models now. This is what we are trying to do. I don't have results yet to share, but it's an area in which many groups are working right now to make models more accurate in the future, because the transition will be cheaper than the one that the models have predicted, and that's a very important message to share. It's gonna be cheaper, and we don't have other options, so it's a positive note, I think.
I'm quite interested to hear Tara's response to that too, because if I put it in very lay person's terms, I think what you're saying is that the models think that the cost is going to be higher because they don't model the other kinds of gains from innovation. It gets cheaper as it scales up, as people learn and practice and do it better. And that's the case in the kind of innovations you've looked at, which are eco-energy, eco-tech kind of innovations. Is that, did you have to grapple this, Tara, when you were working in your civil service days? And
it's interesting because I think as analysts, we always find ourselves with the benefit of hindsight. We know either we were too optimistic or too pessimistic, but it's really tricky to then, when you do your next appraisal, to say, okay, I'm going to shave off 20% of that. We of course do have the Green Book, which tells you have to take an optimism bias out of your, add it on top of your cost estimates and so on. I think the gap there has possibly been just one of modeling techniques and mental models as well, because we have known for decades that the learning curve of technology is dependent on deployment. And so it kind of slightly surprises me if people didn't build in endogenous technological advancement and the kind of cost reduction, because it's an obvious phenomenon you see, and we've also seen it in computers and semiconductors or whatever. I can kind of see that depending on the modeling technique you're using, it's hard. But if you were using, say, an agent-based model or a system dynamics model, it's really easy. And so I think it kind of also suggests a broader agenda for how we model these things.
Yeah, we have so far 16 modelers, teams of modelers. Of course, I mentioned one example that is very clear. Some of them don't model this in this way, and many others do. And there are other inputs to put into consideration, like this thing I mentioned about different policies. So that was happened, for example, with agent-based models. Agent-based models cannot input all the policies at the same time, so we have to analyze them more individually in a different way that with a policy mix. If we want to work, for example, with auctions, so auctions for renewable energy, right now is one instrument that is being more and more used in the developed world. It was used formerly in the developing world. We are seeing more of that, but it's a type of instrument that is not easy to integrate in an energy, environment, and technology model, but it's easier to analyze this with an agent-based model. So this is all the things that we are trying to disentangle now. Thank you very much.
I think let's keep this line of conversation going. I think, did you want to come in on this? Ian, I've got you sort of for the next round of questions, but while we're going on this, do you want to come in, Jonathan, and then Deb on this one, do you?
Yeah, just so Jonathan Mills, currently at DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, but in a previous life I was at Department of Energy and Climate Change and was in charge of renewable electricity subsidies when we introduced auctions for offshore wind. And the thing we saw there was basically offshore wind costs didn't come down very much for quite a long time and surprised us that way. And they came down very suddenly in a way that surprised us. And I guess the two things I'd take from that were we had pleasantly underpriced the policy impacts, so moving to an auction-based model made a bigger impact than we perhaps thought. But also a lot of our cost reduction estimates had been very heavily weighted on engineering developments, bigger turbines, different sorts of technical things, where a lot of the cost was driven out through process improvements and so on, which we just not, sort of interdisciplinary bit of our work had focused very much on engineering and less on, if you like, the kind of manufacturing technology. So I just thought I'd share those as a couple of bits of slightly hazy memory from when we were doing that work.
Yeah, no, but thank you very much. We've seen that as well. So many times what we think about innovation and cost reduction is about the specific parts of the turbines, and we forget that a lot of the savings and a lot of the energy reductions, energy costs are related to the processes themselves. We shouldn't forget that in terms of green innovation, most of the innovation is not radical, is actually progressive. And is most of the time related to new processes or renew processes and not to new products. So that's part of the story as well that we should consider, certainly.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. Deborah Bronnett, I'm from FCDO. I'm currently British Ambassador in Russia. And I'm interested in how international this is and how inclusive. I think you mentioned that you were working, or you had a lot of data about the north. I don't know if that includes Russia, which obviously is slightly sort of outside. But I'm interested in whether you said the transition would be cheaper than predicted. Does that apply to hydrocarbon economies like Russia? Because we're spending a lot of time trying to persuade the Russians to take this seriously, that they need to act. And obviously there's a lot of different incentives at play. I'm also really interested in whether Russia is one of your 63 countries expecting a downgrade as well. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask that too.
Thank you. I mean, actually, probably Matthew can answer this in a better way, because it's more related, I think, to trade and geopolitical issues. So there are two types of countries that are going to be worse with the transition, and are those ones in which the revenues from fossil fuels are very high, and those ones that cannot adapt because they don't have the capacities to innovate. In the case of Russia, we're talking about a country that is actually in the high end in terms of the exports of fossil fuels. We have some research about them, but it's true that in this context it's smaller as well, so I cannot really draw conclusions. But the geopolitics in this case are gonna play a very important role, and if they are able to adapt and innovate, which they are doing, there is an option for them to be better as well. But we need to sell the message that otherwise, I mean, they are going to get worse, because the geopolitics of the energy transition in a renewable energy context is going to be way different than the geopolitics in a traditional fossil fuel economy.
Thanks. So there's a couple of questions on the credit rating.
On who gets downgraded. I can't list them all off. There's 108 countries in the model. We've got 63 that get a downgrade under RPC 2.6. So basically, if we meet the Paris Climate Agreement, there's about 63 that get a downgrade under that. And there's 80 that get a downgrade if we hit RCP 8.5, which is the sort of 4.5 to 5 degree warming world. Under RCP 2.6, the Paris Agreement world, the average downgrade is about a notch. Under the high emissions, the average downgrade is about 2.5 to 3 notches. There's a big debate over whether we should be modeling RCP 8.5, because that's a very high emission scenario, and some of the stuff that's already in pipeline in terms of innovation, decarbonization, shifting away from some of the fossil fuels, we should see ourselves pull away from RCP 8.5, that high emission scenario, by the end of the century anyway. And that I think that's probably true, and I hope that's the direction we go. But the issue is, which scenario is most representative of the world in 2100? It's an interesting question, but it doesn't tell me anything about which scenario is most representative of the world for the next decade. And for the next decade, RCP 2.6 doesn't seem very likely. We could be on the transition within the next decade, but we won't pull our emissions down, not very likely to pull our emissions down that far within the decade. And in fact, if you look over the past 15 years at the emissions we've actually released into the atmosphere versus the emissions that would have been consistent with either one of these two pathways, we're about 7.6% off for RCP 2.6, and we're about 0.7 to 1% off RCP 8.5. So the past decade and a half, we've been on the high emissions scenario. And what we see under that high emission scenario is that even within the decade, countries like the UK are going to get a downgrade.
Why?
Right.
Because, we're probably the least likely to have, I don't know,
Sure.
displacement of people.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are several reasons. One of the things is that not all ratings are created equal. So the change between AAA and AA represents an increase in default probability of maybe 0.01%. A AA country is very unlikely to default. It can happen, has so in the past decade, but very rare. But if you're already a country that's rated close to junk or at junk, then a further deterioration in your macroeconomic outlook, yeah, it's bad news, but it's not going to lower you even further. You weren't going to pay your debt anyway, right? So for those countries, the downgrades aren't as big in terms of the number of notches. And what we do see in the results is that the majority of the downgrades are concentrated amongst the highest rated sovereigns. Right? So it's the UK's, it's Europe, it's the United States and Canada. They're the ones that see the biggest downgrades. But that's partially because they've got the best ratings now. Interestingly, we are just about to complete a piece that does this for biodiversity and nature loss rather than for climate change. And there we see the exact opposite. It's Indonesia and Madagascar and Nigeria and Ethiopia that get slammed with downgrades as a result. And that's largely because their economies are more heavily dependent on things like timber and forestry and agriculture. And so they're very at risk there. I think...
Yeah, I've seen one more question. I mean, I think you're not answering the Russia question.
No.
That's fine.
I'll follow up after with you. I don't have the results.
I think we've got one more question on the sovereign credit rating round.
Yes, just a question. I mean, some of the countries are able to borrow in their own currency, which makes a huge difference to the impact of a downgrade. And I just wondered whether your model affected that. And just thinking back to the time of the euro area crisis, if you're a country that isn't able to devalue at all, then that can, any downgrades can seriously result in internal lack of competitiveness of businesses very, very quickly. And the classic example of that was, a restaurant on the Italian side of the border, which had 8 percentage point borrowing difference compared to one on the Austrian side of the border. So I'm just thinking if you could talk about the difference between whether or not you're having to borrow in a foreign currency or in a currency where you can't devalue.
We do get this question a lot because a lot of people have read Stephanie Kelton's book on modern monetary theory. I'll answer the question first and then I'll speak a little bit about MMT. Countries that issue their own currency have defaulted in the past. It's possible. It happens. So the fact that you issue your own currency does not insulate you from the other macroeconomic consequences that can lead to a downgrade. So we're not protected just by that. The costs, basically, when the economy is in trouble, there are a few different things that we can do to right the public finances. We can default, but that's a poor strategy because it leads to a bad future outcome. We can't do that again, right? See Argentina, they struggled. Yeah. Let's see them default a few times, and and see what happens. I mean, this is not a good strategy. Default, if you want to argue that defaulting is the appropriate strategy for the UK going forward for net zero, we can have that discussion.
I've put the UK in a slightly different
Yeah.
category because of its long history that it would
Right.
not want to see jeopardized, I think.
So another thing we can do,
Which is why inflation is quite attractive.
right? So we can inflate the debt away. The issue, though, that we're seeing now is that if you have high expectations of inflation, then the interest rate that's going to be required on your public borrowing is higher anyway. So it's not going to reduce your rollover cost of debt. In fact, it could increase it. And in fact, what we're expecting now, because of inflationary expectations we see today, is that the cost of debt in the UK could well rise by more than some of the climate change effects will have over the next decade. So inflation is a costly way of doing it too. The best way of doing it is, of course, to grow the economy and to make sure that the growth rate of your economy is higher than the interest rate on your debt. Right? Because that way the size of the GDP pie that you're taxing is growing faster than the amount you have to pay off. And the way to do that is to invest in the complementary assets, to drive the innovation, build your productivity, become more competitive internationally. That's the way to deal with it. On modern monetary theory, Keynes said it first, so it's not particularly modern. It's an accounting identity that basically all the money that exists has to come from somewhere and go somewhere. So it's more of an identity than a theory. And the policy tool that's used is taxation, which is a fiscal policy, so it's not particularly monetary. So modern monetary theory is neither modern nor monetary nor theory, but it does make for a good book.
So is this on a new round? I want to give Ian a chance to come. Okay, or is this on this?
No, it's new.
Okay, so Ian, thank you for being patient.
That's okay. I just had two specific potential policy directions where it'd be interesting to get Christina's and Matthew's comments for net zero. One is the stimulus of retail markets in long-term fixed electricity price contracts, which has the potential to lower the cost of capital for investors in renewable energy at the same time as stabilising household electricity bills. And the second is the role of border carbon adjustments and the embedding of carbon into world trade arrangements, because without that we'll just see more of the carbon leakage from any form of carbon taxation that we've seen for the last 15 years. So do you have opinions on either of those two policy areas? Thanks.
Thanks. Christina?
I have views on the second.
Yeah, me too. But
do you have views on the first?
I was thinking, retail market electricity to stabilize the domestic bills. Yes, I mean, what we've seen is that actually feed-in tariffs, for example, have had this negative impact because of the cost passing through the consumers. So if we manage to create a policy that is well designed, that allows to stabilize these costs, yes, that's perfect. Regarding the border carbon adjustment mechanism, a lot of debate these days as well with the European Union, the EU ETS, the UK ETS. There is not, as far as I am aware, clear evidence that that has happened, that there has been carbon leakages. There is mixed evidence on that, but it's something that we will need to take into consideration more and more in the future if we are going towards targets that are stringent, and we are dealing with contexts in which targets might not be that stringent. If you want to add.
So you will always know that if you have two economists, you'll have at least three opinions. And so my view is, I mean, the research that I've seen and some of the work I've done has shown that carbon leakage has been a serious problem in some of the carbon policies that we've had, and particularly around Kyoto Protocol. The leakage effect may well have exceeded the reductions in wealthy countries, and as a result, global emissions may have risen. due to that leakage effect. It's hugely important. We are working on, we're working at the intersection of economics and law, which is extremely complex and extremely difficult to do. I think that without carbon border adjustments, we are unlikely to make the decarbonization needs of nations. I think that if we start to introduce them, then what we will see is a race to the beginning of the supply chain. Because if the carbon is going to be taxed, it only needs to be taxed once. And every country knows that if their fossil fuels are going to be taxed somewhere along the supply chain, they might as well try and capture that revenue. Which means the first one in the supply chain gets to keep the revenue, because they could tax it as it comes out of the ground, and that could go a long way to compensating the OPEC countries for losing the assets. So that might be an interesting outcome.
Do you want to come back on that, Ian? Or? No, that's good. We've got a question right at the back. We're almost. You go.
Hello, cool. My name's Sam Reed. I work in emissions trading in Bay, so I've been thinking a lot about border carbon adjustments. But I've got a different question. So there's been some kind of talk, a couple of points about kind of modelling and kind of the difficulties there, and that we always underestimate innovation, etc., etc. Have you got any thoughts on kind of uncertainty and how to think about uncertainty in the context of policy making when decision makers are usually quite risk averse but still need to make some quite bold decisions to reach net zero? How should we think about uncertainty there? If that makes sense.
Sam,
absolutely.
I hadn't recognized you. We met online.
I've got my lockdown hair.
It's something that I think, we are taking more and more into consideration. And the message to policymakers, I guess, in this case, is models are dealing with uncertainty. We need to inform better these pigtails and so on. But in terms of the cost and what this transition is going to cost, what we know, and I learned a lot about this from Matthew, is that inaction is going to be way more expensive than acting now. And the more we delay, the more costly it will be. So that's the main message. Once we got this message, we shouldn't, and I know it's very easy when I'm not putting the money, we shouldn't think that much about the uncertainty, because the big tails and the risks that we are facing are way bigger than the bold decisions you mentioned we are taking.
Is it Lewis? Yes. I think this might be the penultimate question.
It's a lot of pressure.
Comment.
Louis Coiffet-Gunn. I work for the Open Innovation team. We're like an internal consultancy across government that gets external experts to input to projects. Our current biggest project is with the Ministry of Defence to help them with their sustainability. They're particularly interested in natural capital registers. I just wondered if you were aware of any good examples or you had any comments on this as an approach. Thanks.
Clearly.
Yes. Natural capital accounting is most of what I have done over the past decade. The people who are best at this in the UK are at the University of East Anglia. It's Andrew Lovett and Kerry Turner and Sylvia Farini. They have developed natural capital maps for East Anglia, and they're the highest quality I've seen anywhere. Denmark's got some good ones, but it's these guys at UEA. On top of this, we've got FTEC, which is an environmental economics consultancy here in the UK. They've compiled more natural capital accounts than anybody else I've met. And beyond this, the UK's ONS is one of the world's leaders. I mean, really, the team there with Adam Dutton at its head, they are on par with what the Netherlands are doing, what the Australians are doing. They are really amongst the best in the world. My suspicion is that for defence purposes, it's not necessarily the UK's natural capital that matters. It's how natural capital deteriorates in other parts of the world. The UN Statistics Commission adopted this year an official statistical standard for developing natural capital accounts, which is a huge, huge step forward. It sounds boring. It's not. It really, really matters. And there are now over 30 countries around the world compiling accounts based on that framework. So that's going to be a good data source into the future.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll give the last question or comment to Graham.
Hi, I'll be brief. Graham Pendlebury. I used to be Environment Director at DFT for a number of years, so I'm going to bring this down a level or two and put you on the spot a bit, because it seems to me that from a UK perspective, there's an inherent contradiction between the necessity to decarbonise the economy and drive to net zero with the desire to maintain the UK as an industrial economy. And the risk from the decarbonisation agenda is borne heavily by, thinking about the levelling up discussion earlier on, by many of the left behind areas where the older industries are sort of concentrated. Now, the glib answer that's always given is, well, we'll transition to green technologies, so stop making steel and start making wind turbines or ground source heat pumps or other newer technologies. But my question is, how is that actually brought about? What are the mechanisms for doing that without having some sort of vast Gosplan style state planning system, which is difficult to envisage in the country?
Go first, Matthew, and then to you, Christine.
I don't think we're going to innovate coal-fired power plants to the point that they're decarbonized competitive. It's not going to work. So the old industries are out. They're going out. We can waste time trying to prop up these dying dinosaurs, but it's not going to work. So those communities are going to face trouble even if we don't decarbonize. You're right that glib answers of we'll just make them green won't work. And you're right that I don't think the state can have any hope of providing the funds to give them an alternative. What can be done is the state can fund and capitalize a green investment bank, which can crowd in private finance, which can develop new industries in these areas. I think that's a useful option. I think one of the ones that we should be doing here in the UK is developing production facilities for treated timber products to be used in buildings. It can decarbonize the buildings, it can provide new innovation, or high innovation industry here in the UK, and we have the material scientists here in the UK who are doing the science. The problem is all the production's happening in Botswana. Why? Let's fund this and let's get this going and make it a UK industry.
I don't have many more to add. That the R&D is a way to promote this in those less developed areas, to empower people in these rural areas, and I think there is a way to transform this trade-off, because this is the clearest trade-off in this, and probably the elephant in the room in a context like the UK. But we can transform it if there is, in my opinion, a lot of R&D and government public procurement to boost these areas. Yeah.
Matthew, do you want to comment? Matthew Gill is another policy fellow, has a terrible poker face, because I can see even behind a mask, his eyes going up and down during. Do you want to comment?
Sorry.
Perhaps introduce yourself.
I'm Matthew Gill. I'm at the Institute for Government. I don't have a comment formulated, actually. I think it's very
Well, we'll just leave your eyes maybe to speak.
Right. I thought that was a fascinating comment to make, Graham. There's obviously a trade-off between the conversation we're having earlier today and the conversation we're having now.
But I wondered if your previous, civil service role, where you were trying to think about investment and finance, whether you saw any parallels.
I guess I'm sceptical as to whether a green investment bank would help with levelling up. I guess it would make me sceptical about that.
Why?
Because it isn't going to create you can only invest where there is where there are the propositions to invest in through that kind of model. And those propositions are not going to necessarily exist in those parts of the country that have been dealing with the previous technologies. And so alongside the provision of government funding, you would also need other programs that are going to actually create that innovation in other parts of the country. And the rationale for where that would be, I think would have to be worked through.
Final word to Cristina.
No, I just have a question. Do you think more localized type of bank system, in the sense that credit societies in which the people in the areas have a say in which kind of projects these societies fund or invest, is a way to go or not?
It might be a way to marshal enthusiasm for particular local projects, but there's a big risk with that kind of development that it's subscale and doesn't invest in, or can't invest at the scale that's necessary to actually deliver that. And that kind of crowdsourcing of ideas and enthusiasm is not going to have the technical expertise to select the projects.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think what I've done is kick-started the conversation that's going to continue over drinks. So I don't have anything much to say other than just two things. The first is to say how just really pleased we are, everyone at the Centre for Science and Policy, to be able to assemble this group here this afternoon and into the evening. Who knows, it may be the last time that, I don't know whether we would quite plan this kind of meeting for a month's time, I don't know, but it's really precious, and we certainly really appreciate it. And so looking forward to you joining us all for a drink in a moment. Thank you very much to those that took part in the panel discussion on levelling up, and thank you very much for those that took part in the discussion on the brain and mind development in teenage years and what this means for public policy, which I thought was another great discussion. And thank you particularly, of course, to Cristina and Matthew for this last session. So thank you all.